While I was playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3, I was continuously astonished by the quality of the side content. Side quests were vast and varied, complete with overarching storylines and a surprising number of voice-acted cutscenes. There were hidden colonies and characters, even some zones were just completely optional. Sure, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 also had many of these elements, though definitely not to this degree or quality. But the more of the game I played, the more I began to feel that something was off. Critical characters that had appeared in important cutscenes were suddenly relegated into side quests, their plotlines completely dropped from the central narrative. Furthermore, much of the game's story emphasized the limited time the characters were operating under, which made digressing into 24 hours of side quests feel a little awkward. This incongruity only increased by the fact that actively doing side quests will place you some 20 levels above most story enemies and bosses, at least until the level curve begins to climb rapidly during the final stretches of the game, clearly implying that they expect you to engage with some of the side content despite the narrative's urgency. And so I started to wonder, maybe some of this stuff shouldn't have been optional in the first place. The game partially makes this point for me. During several instances throughout the game, you'll be stopped to complete mandatory hero quests, specialized side stories in which you explore and learn about a new party member before eventually unlocking them. Other times, the game will bring you through a narrative cul-de-sac to complete a side story, where you unfold one of the outstanding narratives driving each of the game's central 6 characters. Unfortunately, this approach has some severe limitations. By forcing larger stories into more digestible, side quest-sized escapades, a lot of details start to get lost in the margins. Take for instance Juniper's hero quest, Natural Selection. On paper, the story here is excellent, about a colony who has utterly lost the will to fight, who have become resigned to their fate and simply wait for death. What would the perspectives of these people look like? How do they live? How will Noah and company possibly convince Juniper away from such a deeply entrenched worldview? It's too bad, then, that the execution of this particular conflict is pretty flat. Instead of really getting into the depths of these characters' mindsets and exploring the culture of the colony, the team manages to change Juniper's perspective in no less than 3 conversations, a monumental change in a trivial amount of time. At one point in their quest, Juniper reminisces about how Noah's words had a profound impact on their thought process. When you told me that you would release us from the flame clock, I thought if you were really telling the truth, it would make life easier. Except, the conversation they're referring to occurred no more than 5 minutes ago in real time, and about 30 feet from where they're standing now. The result is that Juniper's words feel hollow and flaccid, less the result of an honest shift in perspective and more the demands of a side quest nearing completion. I mean, the game dedicates more time to Xeon's potato farming than it does this suicidal colony. So Juniper's quest, as well as many other hero quests, ultimately feel inelegant, not due to a lack of good ideas or insight, but because that's simply the natural conclusion to a story that needs to set up the culture and characters of an entire colony in about 20 minutes flat, not to mention establishing and resolving a colony's central conflict as well. Indeed, to adhere to this structure, Xenoblade 3 often employs little tricks to make the decision to destroy a flame clock a little more palatable. Many of the colonies and their leaders, like Valdi or Alexandria or Fiona or Triton, turn out to be largely uninvested in the outcome of the war, and as such, don't need very much convincing to do anything else. But not only is that often far less interesting than our heroes having to struggle to change each colony's mind, the game uses this trick a little too often. If no one really wants the war to continue, then why hasn't anyone risen up against their consoles before, or at least tried to mount a more definitive offensive? I suppose you could make some thematic justifications here, but it's too bad this point is not more explicitly addressed within the game itself. Ultimately, it's just a little strange to me that Xenoblade 3 would choose Juniper's relatively weaker storyline as a required hero quest, while much stronger stories like Ashira and her respective Ascension quests are left totally optional to the player. The game's side stories suffer similar limitations. A majority of these quests serve to complete character arcs and flesh out the backstories of our main cast, but making them optional side quests has 2 primary implications. Firstly, these storylines are also truncated to fit the confines of a singular quest, albeit to a much lesser extent than the specific heroes. This is because they tend to be much longer and are supported by more robust cutscenes and in some cases completely new side areas. Secondly, since most of these quests are optional, the game cannot assume that the player has done them. In other words, the primary story of the game can't build off what happens or what's learned in these quests, because depending on the player's actions, the characters wouldn't have experienced them. This means that several storylines and characters are placed in a kind of narrative limbo, like Nimue or Shania, and much like some of the hero quests, the game requires you to do Noah and Mio's side stories. So at that point, why not just make them all mandatory? Or better yet, why not just weave each character's story more seamlessly into the narrative itself, and offer a more involved exploration, instead of rigidly setting aside a chunk of the story dedicated to, say, Lanz's backstory? I wonder then if a more Dragon Quest approach might have been more successful with Xenoblade 3. One of the biggest strengths of Dragon Quest's narratives are not the central plot tying everything together, but the little vignettes that happen while you visit each town. Similarly, Xenoblade 3 could have taken a similar approach by placing the larger story on the back burner and instead putting a more conscious effort on fleshing out each colony and its inhabitants. Allowing more time for the colonies and their specialized cultures would further enable each vignette to flesh out its own narrative and structure, no longer being bound to the demands of a single quest. One could argue that the game already does this to an extent, as many of the regular side quests in the colonies end up contributing to some ongoing storyline specific to that colony. And while that's good for the regular side quests, it doesn't change the idea that many of the colony's justifications for destroying their flame clocks feel too easy or too trite to really resonate emotionally. So what am I really getting at here? Sure, maybe the game would have been better off had it delineated its side and main content a little differently, but does that matter? Well, it might be surprising, but the purpose of this video isn't really to talk about Xenoblade 3's quest design. In reality, I'm actually far more interested in the game's ending. Because I don't like the ending at all. For me, it represents a critical failure on all fronts, from a simple, intuitive sense to its subtextual implications to even the metatextual themes it presents. And it wasn't until I began to think about the ending a little more that I realized precisely why the game's quest structure bothers me so much, and how that structure impacts the broader meaning of the themes of the game as a whole. So for the next little while, I want to explore Xenoblade 3's ending, and in particular, why I found it to be so dissatisfying, and how the rest of the game subtly reinforces this ending. The setup for the final chapter and ending is fairly simple. Break into Origin, the structure which holds all of the data of Bionis and Allrest, defeat Mobius, and cease the endless war that allows Mobius's control over Ionios, finally giving the people in the world the freedom to choose what to do with their lives. But over the course of the chapter, it becomes more clear what ending Mobius's reign and rebooting Origin entails. Since Ionios is a world frozen in time, rebooting Origin means restoring the state of the worlds before their initial failure. That is, erasing Ionios from existence to bring back Bionis and Allrest and restore the flow of time. And that is exactly what happens. Noah and party beat Zed, the manifestation of humanity's fear, reboot Origin, and go back through to their respective homeworlds, losing their memories of Ionios in the process, though the game hints that our characters may eventually reclaim some of this lost memory. So on the surface, a pretty happy ending, right? Our heroes break everyone free of an oppressive, horrifying system and get to live out their full lives, rather than the artificial 10 years forced upon them by Mobius. And while it's sad that they had to give up Ionios in the process, that sacrifice serves a clear thematic purpose. We must be willing to face an uncertain future, to look past that fear, lest we rot in a meaningless purgatory, clinging on forever to what we already have, what we already know. Except, the more I thought about this ending, the more it didn't quite sit right with me. It just felt like there were some details the game hadn't fully considered. Like, take the people of the city, for example. As those who exist outside the system of the flame clocks and limited lifespans, born from natural human conception instead of artificially created, the people of the city just get wiped away from existence, since they were only born after the advent of Ionios. Of course, the game does imply that the city's erasure is not as permanent as it initially may seem, a point which I'll dissect in a lot more detail later, but it felt strange that for a game about giving people the ability to decide their own fate, an entire group of people were simply not granted that opportunity. But there's also a bigger assumption the game makes that I believe forms the core of my problems with this ending. Namely, it's the idea that it's not just the rules and systems which govern Ionios that are wrong, it's Ionios itself that's wrong. Not only does the ending emphatically support this idea, but Noah explicitly states the destruction of Ionios as his objective.
If the world won't let us choose outside these narrow bounds, I want nothing more than to rip this world apart.
Ionios is the endless now. It is the fear that holds everyone back. That raises a pretty critical question then. Why exactly is Aionios wrong? Why does it need to be destroyed? And most importantly, why does the game think this? It might seem like a pretty silly question. Having young children perpetually fight a brutal war that serves absolutely no one is obviously terrible. But I would argue that Aionios doesn't need a war to sustain itself. As Nia tells us at the beginning of chapter 7,
controlling origin means controlling the world. And having shackled it, he can bend it to his will.
So by that logic, why not just defeat Mobius and change the rules of Aionios instead of erasing it? While the exact mechanisms behind the flame clocks and the limited lifespans are unclear, surely these things can be reversed. I mean, isn't that what we spend a majority of the game doing anyways? Freeing people from the clutches of the flame clock and allowing them to live out the rest of their days? Not only that, but reading the plaques about the city's founder states that one of the founders started as an Agnian soldier and surpassed 80 years of age, though the way she achieved that remains shrouded in mystery, showing that there is some precedence here for overcoming the limited lifespans. Nonetheless, it seems like the twisted system of Aionios is not something intrinsic to the world itself, but simply a feature designed by Mobius, a feature that can evidently be patched out. On some level, I think the game recognizes that this argument against Aionios isn't very compelling, and so much like the hero quests and the ease with which everyone chooses to rebel against the flame clocks, the game begins to stack the deck. In this case, with the annihilation events, large anomalies which tear apart the world piece by piece. These anomalies are something of an anomaly themselves within the story. Their origin is never properly explained, and they're mostly background elements for the game's runtime, occasionally appearing for a character to get out of a messy situation. However, they do provide a great reason for why Aionios needs to be destroyed. It's literally unstable. If left untouched, Aionios will eventually be left uninhabitable, and so rebooting Origin is really just averting a certain disaster. We see this concept play out in other aspects of the narrative too. Interlinking for too long also begins some kind of unstable, destructive process between the characters. The problem with this explanation though is that it's really just the game begging the question, why does the blending of two things, be it characters or worlds, cause annihilation events? We could easily imagine a different version of Xenoblade 3 where this isn't the case, where the annihilation events are removed as a plot element, and the game would largely be identical to the version we have. Not much of the story would have to be changed. So since they're not essential to the story, it feels like the annihilation event's only real purpose is to justify the destruction of Aionios, rather than act as a symbol for a larger, more metaphorical argument the game is making. In other words, the events themselves are the argument, a gimmick, as the game might call them, rather than the support for one. And so we're back to that central question. Why does Aionios need to be destroyed? To be clear, when I ask this, I'm not looking for an in-universe explanation. Instead, I'm looking for a narrative one, some sort of storytelling reason as to why Aionios should go. But upon looking at the evidence the game provides, it doesn't seem like there's a very good reason. In fact, all of the major themes about living one's best life against the specter of death or enacting lasting change under a corrupt system can be entirely retained without the destruction of Aionios nor the people of the city. But even supposing you could find a reason for the world's demise beyond what I've laid out here, I would argue that that isn't a very good route to go, because the game's ultimate conclusion about Aionios suggests a number of disturbing things about Xenoblade Chronicles 3's themes, things which I think stray far from the bittersweet ending the game would have us believe it is, and it is these things which left me unhappy with this ending. It's pretty clear from the outset that Xenoblade 3 has something to say about our modern world. If not saying something specific, then it at the very least is attempting to capture a kind of feeling about the modern world. That much is obvious from Zed's speech at the end of the game, where Senna states,
"We learned that for many, there aren't any choices on the table at all, because they were taken from them by a bunch of crusty old mutters."
It's not exactly subtle. Nevertheless, Xenoblade 3 is clearly tapping into a seemingly growing sentiment that our institutions are failing us, that we're trapped in our own endless now, stuck underneath the heel of an outdated generation who only care about themselves. It's a fine metaphor, but the decision to reboot Origin at the end starts to throw some muck into the woodwork, and what's left afterwards is pretty dire. By resetting the world back to its form before Origin took over, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 adds a very specific question to the metaphor. When exactly did we enter our own endless now? More importantly, When did the metaphorical clock stop? And where must we return to in order to save humanity's future? While Xenoblade 3 may have a fairly concrete answer to that question in its own fictional universe, it's a lot more unclear from the perspective of our own world, but Xenoblade 3 does provide the beginnings of an answer. Aionios can largely be seen as a cultural melting pot. That's not much of a stretch. In fact, that's almost exactly what it is, a combination of multiple different backgrounds, races, and regions thrown together into one shared space. Thus, as the progeny of this melting pot, the people of the city act as a sort of mixed race people, sharing and combining these cultures to create something entirely new. Some of the city would undoubtedly be conceived from both Kevis's and Agnes's races, quite literally mixed-raced in that instance. You're probably already beginning to see the trouble. If Aionios is interpreted as such, Xenoblade 3 acts as a rejection of the very idea of a cultural melting pot. Indeed, as we saw earlier with the Annihilation events, the very being of Aionios is unstable, a product which inevitably produces destructive conflicts, an utterly unsustainable idea. The people of this land only have a future when the melting pot dissipates, and all the races go back to the land that they originally came from. But the game actually takes it a step further. Not only must the land be sacrificed, but so too its endogenous life forms. In effect, Noah and party's final decision to erase Aionios is not unlike an ethnic cleansing, a targeted erasure of a specific group of people based entirely on their immutable identity upon conception. The title of one of the game's ending themes, as the world splits apart, is literally titled Where We Belong. But why does Noah belong in Bionis and Mio in Alrest? Because they were born there? I don't find that reason altogether compelling. Under this new paradigm, the way the game treats the city is appalling. Throughout our initial exploration of the city, we're introduced to the Conservatives, a group of people who wish to remain spectators of the war and maintain the status quo. On the whole, the Conservatives are presented as an obstacle, apathetic people who wouldn't care if the world burned. But in this new light, it turns out the Conservatives are actually fighting for something entirely different, even if they themselves don't realize it. They're fighting for their right to exist, a right which Noah and company consummately deny. The extent to which the game demonizes the Conservatives is downright mean-spirited in hindsight, but perhaps the destruction of the city would have been more palatable had the city's people actually had a say in the matter. Unfortunately, our main cast of 6 is composed of everyone but the people of the city, so in the end, the people who have the most to lose are exactly the people who don't get a perspective. Now, to be fair in all of this, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that this was not the intention of the ending here. Nevertheless, the game does seem to acknowledge, at least implicitly, its poor treatment of the city. Near the end of Origin, Monica and Gondor are very literally and quite awkwardly inserted into Origin and the plot itself.
You're not going back!
Well, you know, I got curious and wanted to see the face of our real enemy with my own eyes. So, here I am.
Like I said, not exactly the most robust justification. What's even more bizarre though is that these two do absolutely nothing afterwards, not even garnering a single line of dialogue until after the final boss is beaten, and it's time to make a decision about the future of the world. So if they're going to do nothing in the interim, why bother including them in the ending at all? The only logical answer is that Monica and Gondor are included precisely to give the city a voice, but that really doesn't work at all for reasons I'll get into a little later. Either way, the game does at least admit the city should have a say in their future, which makes their destruction feel all the worse. But I suppose I should address the elephant in the room, the premise with which my argument has so far been largely based on. Are the people of the city really erased at all? The game seems to imply that that might not actually be the case. Melia makes mention that the people of the city represent the future, while Gondor later claims that,
"Oh, don't you start minding us now. Just having the chance to be born in that world you make, that'll be plenty."
This seems to suggest that though the people of the city will be erased in the short term, they will eventually be reborn as the years and decades progress in the long term. So that all seems pretty straightforward then. The people of the city do live, and there's no ethnic genocide. Great. Well, the only way the city living on after the reset works is if we completely remove any ambiguity from the ending, i.e. the two worlds do find a way to safely reconnect, and everyone from the city eventually does get a chance to live, despite Gondor suggesting it was only a chance. The problem, though, is simply that this idea is implausible, ridiculous even, and suggestions otherwise lead Xenoblade 3 down yet another thorny thematic path. More fundamentally, however, is that the happy ending Xenoblade 3 desperately wants to impart its players with is at odds with the seriousness the game places on its final decision. If the game is going to pretend like erasing Aionios is some weighty sacrifice, there had better be some consequences. There have already been many criticisms of 3's ending, saying the whole adventure was effectively just a dream, and while that's not a particularly charitable reading, the idea behind it is. Decisions should have consequences, but by ensuring everyone, memories included, is eventually restored, nothing has been lost. You could argue that what's truly lost are the characters' relationships with each other, but with the assertion that the city's people will be reborn and that the two worlds will eventually reconnect somehow, Xenoblade 3 seems reluctant to even do that much. Quite simply, the game needs to admit that Gondor's idea of rebirth is absurd. Why should we expect this to occur? The world before Origin, though it bears many similarities to Aionios, is a different world, with different ecosystems, climates, political structures, cultures, and even people. Are we supposed to believe that in a completely different environment, the same people will get together, have children, and that those children will be just like the people of the city? What about people who fell in love from both worlds? It really just doesn't make sense, and if the game were being a little more honest, it would have to acknowledge that a person who speaks, talks, acts, looks, thinks like Gondor will never exist again. That was a person unique to Aionios, who could never exist beyond the confines of Aionios. But for the game to make this recognition, it would have to acknowledge that something special, something truly unique was lost in Aionios' erasure. Unless, of course, something else, beyond the environment, is in control of who is or isn't born, something that informs how the world should truly be. Perhaps something like the passage of fate. And it's here that another strange facet of the game is revealed. Xenoblade 3 at times feels like a staggeringly deterministic game. Throughout the years of Aionios, people are recycled and recycled after their 10 years to continue fighting within the endless war. But no matter which colony, which rank, which role they're born into, there remains a continuity from one iteration to the next. Yorin is always a chubby loser who gets run over by tires. Noah and Mio always rebel in some fashion and fall in love. Ethel and Kamaravi always share a special connection to each other. While it's not unreasonable to expect some continuity between iterations, especially when the replication process isn't perfect, leaving some latent memories behind in the subconscious, the degree to which this continuity exists seems to extend far beyond a mere glitch in the system. Even if the colonies are embroiled in the same unending war, the game spends most of its runtime showing just how distinct each colony and its people truly are. It seems unlikely that these new environments wouldn't have some kind of an effect. Surely Noah would find a new girl to love eventually, and yet they always do fall in love as if it were their destiny to do so. But the deterministic flourishes don't stop there. Why again do the characters want to break the cycle of the endless war? It might feel like we've already answered this question. Who would want to operate under this ruthlessly oppressive system? That's entirely fair, except Xenoblade 3 seems to provide another reason altogether, and it's rather interesting.
You gotta find our hope. Our city. It's the only way you're gonna defeat the real enemy. And reclaim what was lost. The way the world and life should be.
This is how it should be. This is human nature. We'll weave the tale that we were always meant to tell.
I'll continue down the road of the future that was meant to be.
Noah, all of us here want the same thing. It's how the future should be.
I think we met because we were supposed to, Mio. It was meant to be.
This isn't how it's supposed to be.
That's a rather strange thing to say, isn't it? That we should change the world to how it's supposed to be? What exactly is the world supposed to be? It's made even more frustrating by the fact that none of the characters really know the answer either. Who's to say that the world that would result from resetting Origin is any better or worse than what Aionios is offering? The game takes this point for granted, relying on information that we, the players, know from previous Xenoblade games to fill in that justification. Who knows? Perhaps Bionis and Alrest devolved into an authoritarian hellscape right before Origin activated. Unlikely, but the game does little to say otherwise. Ultimately, the idea that we should restore the world to its original state because it should be that way rather than it being the way we want plays right into this deterministic attitude. Ionios isn't wrong because of its oppressive systems, it's wrong because it's an aberration from what was defined by destiny. Similarly, the characters retain strangely specific continuity over dozens of iterations and rebirths and environments because that is the way they were meant to be. Noah is destined to fall in love with Mio, and all the people of the city were always meant to be born, exactly as they are, no matter the environmental context or even what universe we're in. And so the New World Order Noah and company construct for themselves is not really a world of choice, of the freedom to live out one's life by one's own will, but a life whose path was already dictated long ago. People whose personalities are merely an inevitability, and whose relationships have been decided by fate itself. For a series that's ostensibly about releasing the shackles that fate weighs upon us, that's a pretty bold choice. The reason why I find Xenoblade 3's ending so frustrating is that it's just utterly unwilling to consider the broader implications of its premise. This reason alone is why the last section of this essay even exists at all, and unfortunately this sort of unwillingness permeates a lot of the game's story. Take for instance Melia and Nia themselves. When I first launched the game, I was incredibly curious to see how these two would be handled. After all, leading two nations into a vicious conflict hardly seems like something Melia or Nia, two of the previous game's kindest and most empathetic characters, would ever consider doing. How did they get here? Were they being coerced? I was curious to see the game's answers. However, Xenoblade 3 takes perhaps the most boring route possible. The Melia and Nia controlling the nations turn out to be nothing more than automata, with the real versions of the characters both stuck in their own form of stasis, thus effectively removing any culpability or consequences the characters might have had to face. I'm not saying I needed or even wanted Melia or Nia to turn into ruthless dictators in between Xenoblade 2 and 3, but if you're going to bring these characters back, why not do something radical with them? Really swing for the fences. According to Melia, both of the queens could observe what was happening through the eyes of their automata, being forced to watch decades of war under your own name and likeness. Surely that would have some kind of psychological effect.
Then let's thrash those goons, Melia.
Gladly. Together.
Okay, I guess. It's yet another example of the game having its cake and eating it too. Melia and Nia are pretty much exactly as you remember them, even if they really ought not to be. In all fairness, Xenoblade 3 is far from the only story that's dishonest about its own implications, especially regarding time travel. Frankly, depending on the rules of the setting, time travel is just grossly unethical, and a majority of the stories that utilize it cannot or refuse to acknowledge this. Xenoblade 3 certainly tries by allowing all parties to consent to the time travel. Gondor's line about getting the chance to be born is explicitly supposed to serve the role of the city advocate, but here too it feels dishonest. Time and time again, quest after quest, the game repeatedly emphasizes that the city holds a diversity of thought and opinion. We saw that earlier with the conservatives, but it extends to a more general concept of what the city even is, the last bastion in Ionios where people can truly be free to live their lives and express themselves. But now, we're expected to believe that Monica and Gondor alone can represent the city's perspective. That can't be the case, and I'm confident that a not insignificant portion of people in the city would outright refuse to reboot Origin for fairly understandable reasons. But that isn't a perspective that's allowed to be heard, and the people who hold it are eradicated along with everyone else. And really, on a more basic level, Gondor's line itself is incredibly glib. Here we stand at the end of the world and Gondor seems positively giddy to end her own life. Doesn't she have more to say about what her life meant, about what she'll miss, what she wished she could have done, her friends and neighbors? Would she even really be saying this at all? Noah and Party's final decision really illustrates the problem with a lot of these time travel stories. Having your main protagonist alter the lives of millions of people without their consent is not an endearing character trait, nor is it even remotely heroic. It's a little ironic that I mentioned Xenoblade 3 taking inspiration from Dragon Quest at the beginning of this essay, because it turns out they very much did, in the worst possible way. I dislike Dragon Quest XI's postgame for many of the same reasons I dislike Xenoblade 3's ending. Our main heroes decide, in order to save a fallen party member, they will go back in time to just before Yggdrasil's fall, a calamity that killed an innumerable amount of people and left many more suffering, and prevent the tree from falling in the first place. Think of all the pain and suffering we could prevent, Rap suggests. Except, in some ways, Dragon Quest XI is engaging in the same dishonesty Xenoblade 3 is. The decision to go back in time is presented as extremely weighty, not to mention risky, as it should be. But once again, the decision turns out to have no consequences whatsoever. The hero is able to successfully prevent the fall of Yggdrasil, save everyone from a new threat that appears, and everyone who died is restored and lives happily ever after. Eric is still able to reunite with his sister. Sylvando becomes reacquainted with his father, despite the fact that both of these things occur after Yggdrasil's fall, and a whole list of other things that I won't mention right now. Even characters who died before Yggdrasil are brought back to life, despite the fact that it makes no sense. Anything for a happy ending. In other words, the decision to go back in time wasn't weighty at all. It was just the objectively correct decision to make. It's a cynical, bleak ending under the guise of a happy one that completely eschews Dragon Quest's phenomenal ability to create powerful, bittersweet endings. We see the people rebuilding and starting to get their lives back in order immediately after the main game. But these lives aren't valuable. Even if they do pick up the pieces, they will never be as happy as they would have been if Yggdrasil hadn't fallen. And so, these versions of these people are discarded, without their input or consent, all because our protagonists really thought the world should be something else instead. In some ways, this ending is better than Xenoblade 3's, at least our heroes are almost exclusively saving people instead of sacrificing them until some indeterminate point in the future. In other ways, this ending is worse, the equivalent of walking up to someone in a wheelchair and reminding them how much better their life could have been had only they not gotten into that car accident. And that's really the problem, isn't it? These games show us incredible, seemingly insurmountable problems that impact the entire world. They would tell us that we must ardently fight for what we believe in, that we must be the change we want to see. But their narratives tell a completely different story. It is simply not possible to be the change we want to see. In fact, systemic issues are intractable, problems quite literally woven into the fabric of the universe. It was built to be unfair, and so the only way to solve these issues is to change the laws of the universe itself. You might say that's the metaphor, that we must change our existence, our very way of living, to solve the problems facing us. But these games don't actually believe this. When they employ time travel in such ways to fix everything, they only solve these deep-seated issues by pretending they never existed to begin with. After Yggdrasil's fall, how will the people grieve and come to terms with what's happened? Well, it turns out they don't have to. Yggdrasil never actually fell, so there's nothing to grieve over, nothing to mourn, nothing to remember. How will we learn to live in a world that has been intentionally designed to feed off of our deaths and destruction? Well, we don't have to. That world no longer exists. We erased it. There's nothing to learn from. But those aren't really solutions, are they? They're lies, parlor tricks, writerly sleights of hand which obfuscate the fact that these stories don't actually believe these problems have solutions. And it's not honest either. In real life, there is no time travel or redos. We have to deal with what we're given and the situations we find ourselves in. We can't just wish away our grief with magic lamps. But what we can do is live fulfilling lives despite those conditions. But neither Xenoblade 3 nor Dragon Quest XI can accept the idea that that might involve some loss, some sadness in the process. To lose time is to lose much, but that's a lie. Our characters lose nothing. I think the reason why these kinds of stories tend to get off the hook so easily is really in the name. It's a role-playing game where we put ourselves in the shoes of the main protagonist, the hero, so to speak. In reality though, most of us are the lowly NPCs, the people forced to react to everything around us, who can do little to change it. And under those circumstances, I think we would all agree that a hero unceremoniously restructuring our lives without our say-so is unacceptable, and not a world anyone would want to live in. At least I certainly wouldn't. It's a shame that these games can't portray the lives and perspectives of these characters honestly, because there's a powerful story buried right underneath the surface. Plenty of other games can grapple with the idea of what it means to lose someone, what it means to die yourself, and how you can find meaning in your life even at the very end, especially at the very end. How do we deal with the end of something, a person or relationship, when that end is truly permanent? Some of these games can even ask all of these questions without a single line of dialogue. Meanwhile, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has nearly 20 hours of main story only cutscenes, and it can't even bear to glance in the general direction of its victims. It's a game that expects us to believe that an entire group of people will stand and smile as they watch everyone else get a brighter future but themselves, because that's simply the way it's supposed to be. Suddenly, it all started to make more sense to me. the reason why the hero quests and the colony stories feel so underdeveloped, the reason why the game rushes you through the story instead of devoting more time to the people and places of Ionios, the reason why there's so much side content in the game at all. It's because Juniper doesn't matter, nor does Teach, or Ashira, or Colony Tau, or Colony 9, or any other person or colony for that matter. It's because Ionios doesn't matter. It shouldn't be this way, so why really bother getting to know it in more detail? The global affinity chart from Xenoblade 1 makes its return in this game after its absence in 2, but it takes on a remarkably different context. Rather than serve as a monument to all the connections you formed during your adventure, it is instead a memorial, documenting all of the connections that will be destroyed, that weren't important enough to preserve. You might say the argument I've constructed is unfair. I've put the game in a no-win scenario. If the people of the city really stay dead, it's this horrible anti-miscegenation metaphor where our heroes commit a genocide. On the other hand, if the people of the city are reborn, it's a complete act of narrative cowardice, giving rise to a horrible fatalistic interpretation where our heroes have no control over their lives. Yes, that's pretty much what I've done here, but it's also an impasse of the game's own making, born from the thinly justified narrative decision that Ionios should be destroyed. However, there's actually a simple fix to this dilemma, one that will resolve pretty much every problem I've brought up to this point while adding additional meaning to the story at the same time. The solution? Well, I've been alluding to it this whole essay. Switch the roles. Instead of sacrificing Ionios to restore Bionis and Allrest, sacrifice Bionis and Allrest to preserve Ionios. This change has a number of positive implications. Because Ionios will no longer be destroyed, it reverses the awkward race-mixing metaphor. Rather than reject the idea of a cultural melting pot on the basis that it produces irreconcilable conflicts, the idea is now that while a melting pot may inevitably lead to conflicts, they are not terminal and are in fact worth seeing through to the end. And as an added bonus, since there is no reboot and thus the people of the city are alive, there's no concerns about any kind of ethnic cleansing. Because the people of the city are still alive, no one needs to be reborn, and as a consequence, the ridiculous notion that the same exact people will have a chance to live despite being in a completely different environment is now removed. This idea eschews some of the more fatalistic themes of the game. It is simply a more intuitive ending. Rather than effectively rewinding the clock to preserve the future, the game is more straightforwardly about letting go of what once was, what was meant to be, in favor of what is now. In another game, going backwards to go forwards might have been a clever thematic irony, but I don't think it works in this game. It makes more metatextual sense. Much of the game can be read as a commentary on Monolith Soft themselves, and their desire to move beyond the redundant symbols and imagery that have stuck to the Xeno series for decades, and to finally move on to something new. But destroying Ionios in favor of Bionis and Allrest seems incompatible with this idea. Bionis and Allrest, at least in a meta sense, are the endless now, the worlds of the old characters, the old locations, the familiar and comfortable, the known quantity. How can the game claim that Ionios is the endless now, when it seems very much like the uncertain future, in a media landscape where a good portion of modern-day franchises have become a singularity of nostalgia and fan pandering, an Ouroboros of recycled ideas. Having your story about moving on from the past end by effectively plunging us back into the singularity is a strange choice. If Ionios is the world to stay, however, then it does become a story about giving up the familiar, the known, and moving on to something else. Forcing the audience to give up their old toys is, I think, a far more salient and thematically cohesive point for the game to make. Of course, with this tweak in the narrative, some other things will need to be reconsidered. The Annihilation events will need to be altered, resolved in some way, if not outright removed from the story altogether. Furthermore, the game will still need to deal with the consequences of not destroying Ionios. What are the implications of not letting Origin go through the reset? Who will potentially be left behind in that case? The game will have to answer these questions, and more generally, needs to honestly address what leaving Bionis and Allrest behind really means. At least this time though, our protagonists are not actively choosing to ignore the perspectives of people whose lives they are changing. Those perspectives are just inaccessible. I think this provides a far more reasonable moral dilemma for the characters to handle. Believe it or not, I do actually like Xenoblade 3. It does genuinely have some great story beats, particularly the ending of Chapter 5, and arguably the best, most well-rounded cast in the series. But as it's hopefully clear at this point, I find Xenoblade 3's ending to be frustrating. Noah comments that,
In this world, there are so many mingled desires. But does anyone have the right to choose?
And the answer is no. Noah doesn't have the right, nor should he. So why does the game just brush this question aside? Are the rest of those desires simply not worth considering? Some of the lines I included earlier in the essay about the way the world is supposed to be, particularly from Mio and Vandom, shows that the game does understand that the future should be constructed on the basis of what we want, rather than what is meant to be. Yet this is wound around the confusing idea that Ionios isn't and could never be what the characters want. Who's to say what can and can't be the correct future for humanity? Even if Ionios is frozen in time, why can't humanity continue that way? Scary as it may seem, what if human lifespans do grow shorter? Would that make them no longer worth living? The game doesn't really give these questions any consideration. It's clear enough that Xenoblade 3 wants to comment on the human experience, as all good art does, but it fails to consider any acceptable standard of living other than the one that currently exists. It's undeniable that Xenoblade 3 is a game with an admirably humanist point of view, but we should hold ourselves to a higher standard. Does humanity deserve to exist? This should not be a solved question, but one we continuously ask ourselves, prove to ourselves, each and every day. Because a good question, like this one, always has more than one correct answer. And when Xenoblade Chronicles 3 cowers away from its most critical questions right at the end, the game ultimately misses an important point. If humanity must sacrifice thousands of innocent and unwilling people to secure a better, brighter future, then humanity does not deserve a future.